Live humble, humble, humble yourself to build and wrong. Live humble.
Born into slavery, a life of trouble and pain, many things would eventually lead to the tragic Nat Turner Slave Rebellion.
In the summer of 1831, Nat Turner led a slave revolt that sent shockwaves throughout the South. This bloody uprising created a great conflict for plantation owners and slaves alike. This potentially national-scale conflict sent a message to slaves everywhere that revolting would lead to a tragic compromise.
At the time of the Nat Turner Slave Revolt, slavery was at its height. The North had abolished many of its slaves, but the South was still the world's greatest cotton producer, and abolishing slavery would ruin this. One slave child said, "I saw my mammy beat until she was just a living piece of raw meat." John Brown, a violent American abolitionist, said, "Slavery is the sin of America."
Nat Turner was born in Southampton County, Virginia, on October 2nd, 1800. He was born into slavery on the plantation of Benjamin Turner. Little is known about Nat's childhood. He attempted to escape this cruel life a few times, but was never successful.
Nat Turner was extremely religious. He even baptized himself in a local creek. He would pray every night to God and even believed that he spoke to God himself.
Nat Turner even believed he was the Black Moses, and he was ready to lead his people out of slavery.
Well, it takes to an extreme the black slave interpretation of the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament. But if you look at the book of Exodus, and the story of the Hebrews escaping from slavery into freedom, which not surprisingly was a favorite among African American slaves.
He really saw himself as Jesus's ambassador, as the Black Moses of the time.
31. There was an eclipse of the sun. Turner took this to be the sign that he had been promised, and confided his plan to the four men he trusted the most: Henry, Hark, Nelson, and Sam. They decided to hold the insurrection on the 4th of July and began planning a strategy. However, they had to postpone action because Turner became ill.
On August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner started his rebellion. That evening, Turner and 6 other men met in the woods. At 2 a.m., they went to the home of Nat Turner's master. They killed the master, the wife, and the children in the house. As they left the house and got a mile down the road, they realized that they had left a baby in his cradle. Henry and Will went back and killed the baby, while Nat and Nelson went on to the next house.
The next house along the way was the Gills Reese house. Turner killed Reese, and he had a young slave woman named Cherry, who supposedly was Turner's wife.
From this point on, Turner would go around and kill the families, and then recruit the slaves as a part of his rebellion. One example of this is the Catherine Whitehead House, also locally known as the Skykes House. There, he killed the family and buried them in the garden, and then recruited the slaves as a part of his rebellion.
One story of survival was the Nathaniel Francis house, where a slave concealed Mrs. Lavinia Francis in the attic. Thus, her life was spared.
On September 17, 1831, Governor John Floyd issued a proclamation for the reward and capture of Nat Turner.
This is the nightmare that they had even tried to rule out using the Fugitive Slave Act involved in the Constitution. Article 6 of the Constitution allows the U.S. government to use federal troops to put down slave rebellion. That tells you how much white Southerners feared slave revolt.
On October 31st, Ben Phipps, a local farmer, spotted and captured Nat Turner at gunpoint.
My name it is Folkways. pilgrim to Canaan I am bound, traveling through this wilderness.
After, Turner was taken to the Southampton County Jail. There, he was appointed a lawyer, Thomas Ruffin Gray. Gray talked to Turner for days after he was captured. He then took it upon himself to write the Confessions of Nat Turner, a book read by most of the area at the time. In one instance, Gray asked Turner, "You know you're going to be hanged, right?" And Turner replied, "Was Christ not crucified?" This statement would be heard by most of the county and added to what the people thought of Turner.
Walls of Jericho, he marched with spear in hand. Go below them, ram on a Joshua cried.
How's the battle lamb in my hand?
In the next couple of months, every rebel except Nat Turner was quickly killed or captured. During September and into October, nearly 50 accused rebels stood trial in Southampton County. Almost all were executed by hanging.
Walls come a-tumbling down. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho.
On November 5th, 1831, Nat Turner was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The trial only took 48 hours. The man who said, "Was Christ not crucified?" was hanged on November 11th in Jerusalem, Virginia, now known as Cortland, Virginia. His body was then flayed, beheaded, and quartered.
In the bloody aftermath, close to 200 blacks, many of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion, were beaten, tortured, and murdered by angry white mobs. In addition, repressive policies were enacted for not only the enslaved blacks, but also many of the freedmen. No other slave uprising inflicted as severe a blow to the community of slave owners in the United States. Nat is and will forever be regarded as a hero by many African Americans.
Nat Turner finally became well known in present-day life in the 1940s when historian Herbert Aptheker published the first serious scholarly work on instances of slavery resistance in the antebellum South.
Oh, I'm from Louisiana, as you all know. It's where the Jim along Josie's on the go. Josie's all rise when the bell does ring. And this is a song.
1968, William Straiton wrote a controversial book about Nat Turner, which won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. This book was very controversial because many of the facts mentioned were actually false.
Nat Turner was introduced once again into present-day life in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. Nat was an inspiration for the leaders and for the followers of the movement. Malcolm X quoted Nat in many of his speeches and actions, using violence instead of nonviolent protests as Nat did in his rebellion.
Shine on me, shine until tomorrow, let it be.
In North America, but there were no successful slave rebellions in North or South America. Only in the Caribbean with the Haitian Rebellion do you see a successful slave rebellion.
Swing low.
In conclusion, Nat Turner created a huge conflict in which he ended up killing over 55 white men, women, and children. He recruited over 40 slaves as a part of his rebellion. With such a huge conflict, a compromise had to be met, but none was produced. The eventual compromise of the battle he was fighting would be the end of the Civil War. Nat Turner set the stage for all men to stand up for what they believed in, even if it was extreme.
Swing down, chariots, won't you let me ride? Oh, swing down, chariots, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord. Oh, come and easy. I got a home.
In the words of Frederick Douglass,
The thing worse than rebellion is the thing that causes rebellion.